The architect of silence. The rain came down in sheets against the glass tower, each drop a tiny explosion of light against the dark Manhattan skyline. Julian Vane stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, 73 stories above the chaos of the city, watching the world bend to the storm. He didn't know that in less than 3 minutes, a 12-year-old boy would walk through his door carrying a piece of his father's past. He didn't know that the object in the child's pocket would crack open 15 years of carefully constructed silence. And he certainly didn't know that by morning, everything he'd built by erasing where he came from would begin to crumble. What he did know was that the demolition permit for the Oakhaven Library had been signed, sealed, and scheduled for execution in 72 hours. What he didn't know was that his father had died there, teaching children in the basement 3 months ago. The knock came at exactly midnight. Julian turned from the window. His assistant had left hours ago. The cleaning crew wouldn't arrive until 2. Security knew better than to disturb him during what he called his thinking hours, those late stretches when the city slept and he made the decisions that moved billions of dollars across continents. The knock came again, softer this time, almost apologetic. He crossed the expanse of Italian marble, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. The office was designed to intimidate, all sharp angles and cold surfaces, a monument to efficiency. Julian Vane had built his reputation on 2 principles: tear down the old, build the new, and never look back. At 42, he'd made his fortune by identifying properties with sentimental value and converting them into profitable developments. Historic theaters became luxury condos, family-owned bookstores became boutique hotels, and now the Oakhaven Library, a crumbling relic in the Bronx, would become another sleek residential tower with his name etched in steel above the entrance. He opened the door. The boy stood in the hallway, water dripping from his jacket onto the polished floor. He was small for what Julian guessed was 11 or 12, with dark eyes that held none of the nervousness Julian had learned to expect from people who entered his domain uninvited. The child's clothes were clean but worn, jeans with patches at the knees, sneakers that had seen better seasons. In his hands, he held something wrapped in a plastic grocery bag. "You're Julian Vane," the boy said. "Not a question. Security should have stopped you. They did. I told them I had evidence of the bribes you paid to get the Oakhaven permit pushed through." The boy's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "They said I was lying. I said they could either let me up or explain to the press why they turned away a witness when the scandal breaks." Julian felt something cold move through his chest. He'd paid no bribes. The Oakhaven acquisition had been clean, every signature legal, every dollar accounted for. But the accusation alone, spoken by a child in front of cameras, could tie him up in investigations for months. The Riverside project depended on his reputation staying pristine. One hint of corruption and his investors would scatter like pigeons. "Come in," he said. The boy stepped inside, his wet shoes squeaking against the marble. He didn't gawk at the art on the walls or the view of the city spread out below them like a circuit board of light. He walked directly to the center of the room and stopped, waiting. Julian closed the door. "What's your name?" "Elias." "Elias what?" "Just Elias." The boy shifted the plastic bag from one hand to the other. "You signed the demolition order for Oakhaven Library. 72 hours from now, they're going to bring in the wrecking equipment." "That's correct. I need you to stop it." Julian crossed his arms. "And you're going to blackmail me to do it. With evidence that doesn't exist." "I didn't say it doesn't exist." Elias met his gaze without flinching. "I said I'd tell security it exists." Whether it does or not, you'd have to come see for yourself to be sure. And once you're there, you'll understand why the library can't be destroyed. For a moment, Julian considered calling security, having the boy removed, filing a report with the police for attempted extortion. But something in the child's posture stopped him. There was no desperation there, no wild gamble of someone with nothing to lose. Elias stood like someone playing chess, 3 moves ahead, confident in the position, even if the opponent couldn't see it yet. Where's this evidence supposedly located? In the library. In a book on the 3rd floor, East Wing, hidden behind the reference section. Elias reached into the plastic bag and pulled out an object that made Julian's breath catch. This was there too. I thought you might want it back. It was a library date stamp, the old kind made of heavy bronze with a rotating dial for the month and day. The handle was worn smooth from decades of use, the metal darkened with age. Julian had seen one exactly like it, exactly once in his life, in his father's hands, when he was 7 years old, and Silas Vane still worked as a librarian in Queens, before everything fell apart. Where did you get that? I told you. The library. Elias set the stamp on Julian's desk with a soft click. Your father used to use it when he worked there, before he died. The words hit Julian like a fist to the sternum. He hadn't spoken to his father in 15 years. Hadn't known where Silas lived, how he survived, whether he was alive or dead. After Julian's mother passed when he was 16, Silas had fallen into alcoholism, losing job after job, dragging them both down until Julian had been forced to choose between saving himself or drowning with his father. He'd chosen himself. He'd put himself through college on scholarships and spite, built his first company from nothing, and never looked back. Thinking about Silas meant thinking about the apartment with the broken heat, the eviction notices, the nights spent hungry because his father had spent the grocery money on cheap vodka. Julian had survived by cutting that part of his life out completely, by becoming someone so far removed from that scared teenager that the past couldn't touch him. My father's been dead for years, Julian said, though even as he spoke, he realized he didn't actually know if that was true. 3 months, Elias replied. He had a heart attack in the library basement. I was there. So were 8 other kids. He was teaching us math. Julian sat down heavily in his desk chair. The rain continued its assault on the windows. Teaching you. Every Tuesday and Thursday night. Free tutoring for anyone who showed up. He'd been doing it for 6 years, ever since the library stopped having regular hours because the city cut funding. He kept a key. Said books shouldn't gather dust just because politicians couldn't balance a budget. That doesn't sound like the man I knew. People change. Elias picked up the date stamp again, turning it over in his small hands. He talked about you sometimes, said you were smart, said you got out. He was proud of that. Julian laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the cold space. He told a stranger's child that he was proud of me. I'm not a stranger. I knew him for 2 years. Elias's eyes hardened, and he never said it to my face. I found it written in his journal, in the library. That's where the book with the evidence is too. If you want to see it, you have to come with me. Tonight, it's past midnight. The demolition starts at dawn on Tuesday. That gives us 69 hours. I need you to see what you're destroying before it's too late. Julian stood and walked back to the window. Below, the city stretched out in grids of light and shadow. A machine that never stopped consuming and producing, tearing down and building up. He'd learned to be part of that machine, to profit from its hunger. Sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. The Oakhaven site was worth $30 million in development potential. The library itself was worthless, a shell of plaster and old wood that hadn't served its intended purpose in 5 years. But the date stamp sat on his desk like an accusation, and the boy's words circled in his mind. He was teaching us math. He talked about you. He was proud. If I go to this library and find nothing, I'm calling the police. You'll be charged with trespassing, breaking and entering, and attempted extortion. If you go and find nothing, Elias said, I'll turn myself in. Julian grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. My car is downstairs. They rode the elevator in silence, descended through 73 floors of steel and glass until they emerged into the lobby where the night security guard looked up in surprise. Julian waved him off and pushed through the revolving door into the rain. His driver was off duty, so he led Elias to the private parking garage where his Tesla sat, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The boy climbed into the passenger seat without hesitation, buckled himself in, and gave an address in the South Bronx. Julian entered it into the navigation system and pulled out into the storm. They drove north through empty streets, the windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm. The buildings changed as they went, from the soaring glass towers of Midtown to the brownstones of Harlem to the low-rise apartments of the Bronx. The neighborhoods grew darker, the streetlights more sporadic, the sidewalks emptier. Julian hadn't been to this part of the city in 20 years, not since he'd clawed his way out and vowed never to return. You live near here? He asked. 2 blocks from the library, Elias said. With my grandmother. My parents died when I was 6. Car accident. I'm sorry, everyone says that. No one means it. The boy stared out the window at the rain. But my grandmother does her best. She works 2 jobs, cleans offices at night, does alterations during the day. She makes sure I go to school, makes sure I eat, makes sure I don't end up like some of the other kids on our block who deal, or steal, or just disappear. School in the library basement. Real school during the day. Public school, overcrowded, underfunded, but I go. The library was extra. Your father saw that I liked books, liked learning. He said smart kids with no resources were the city's greatest waste. So he decided to do something about it. Julian turned onto a street lined with boarded-up storefronts and chain-link fences. At the end of the block, he saw it, the Oakhaven Library, a 3-story brick building with classical columns and a domed roof, now covered in scaffolding and condemned signs. The windows were dark, the front steps were cracked. A banner across the facade read, Future Site of Vane Residential Tower Luxury Living, coming 2027. He parked on the street. The rain had softened to a drizzle. Elias got out and walked to a side door, half hidden by overgrown bushes. He produced a key from his pocket, the same kind of old brass key Julian's father used to carry on a ring attached to his belt. He gave it to you? Julian asked. He gave copies to all of us. Said knowledge should never be locked away. Inside, the library smelled of mold and dust and something else, something Julian couldn't name at first. Then he recognized it, old paper, thousands of books slowly decomposing in the darkness. Elias clicked on a flashlight and led the way through the main hall, past rows of empty reading tables, past the circulation desk, where someone had left a coffee mug ringed with ancient stains. They climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. The boards creaked underfoot. In some places, the ceiling showed water damage, dark patches spreading like bruises. Julian's architects had surveyed this building and declared it structurally unsound, beyond renovation. Tearing it down was the only economically sensible option. Elias stopped in front of a section marked Reference in faded gold letters. He reached behind a row of encyclopedias and pulled out a book with no dust jacket, just a plain green cover. He handed it to Julian. Page 73. Julian opened the book. It wasn't a printed text. It was a journal, handwritten, in blue ink, the penmanship, careful and deliberate. He recognized his father's handwriting immediately, the same slanted script that had signed birthday cards and permission slips decades ago. The entry on page 73 was dated 4 months earlier. October 12th. Elias stayed late again tonight to work on algebra. The boy has a gift for seeing patterns, for understanding how numbers relate to each other. He reminds me of Julian at that age, before I ruined everything. I wonder if my son knows that I think about him every day. Probably not. I wouldn't blame him for assuming I forgot he existed, but I didn't forget. I just didn't know how to reach across the gap I created. Every time I got sober enough to think about calling, I'd realize I had nothing to offer him but apologies. And what good are apologies from a man who destroyed his child's sense of safety? Better to let him build his life without me dragging him back down. I saw his face in the newspaper last week, some article about his new development project. He looked powerful, untouchable, nothing like the scared boy I failed. Maybe that's my only real accomplishment, pushing him hard enough that he learned to survive without me. Julian's hands were shaking. He turned the page. October 19th. Taught basic trigonometry tonight. 5 students showed up despite the rain. Elias brought a homeless man inside to get dry and made him coffee from the pot we keep in the back room. The boy has an instinct for kindness that I never managed to cultivate in myself. His grandmother is raising him right. It makes me wonder what Julian would have been like if I'd been a better father, if I'd chosen him over the bottle. Would he be kind? Or did my failures make him strong in ways my presence never could have? I don't know. I'll never know. But I'm glad he survived me. Julian closed the book. He could feel Elias watching him in the beam of the flashlight. There's no evidence of bribes in here, Julian said quietly. I know. You lied to get me here. Yes. Julian should have been angry, should have called the police, had the boy arrested, made an example of him. Instead, he felt hollow, scraped clean of the certainty that had carried him through the last 15 years. His father had been here, in this building Julian had marked for destruction, teaching children while Julian built towers in Midtown. Silas had thought about him, written about him, been proud of him from a distance, while Julian had convinced himself that his father was either dead or too drunk to remember he had a son. Why did you really bring me here? Julian asked. Because you need to see the basement. They descended the stairs, went past the main floor, and found a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The basement was larger than Julian expected, a series of connected rooms with low ceilings and exposed pipes. Elias's flashlight swept across makeshift desks constructed from plywood and cinder blocks, chairs salvaged from street corners, a blackboard mounted on the wall with chalk equations still visible. In the corner, there was a sleeping bag, a hot plate, a box of crackers, a case of bottled water. Your father lived here the last year of his life, Elias said. He lost his apartment when rent went up. Instead of going to a shelter, he moved into the library. He said it made sense, being close to the students, being close to the books. Julian walked slowly through the space, taking in the details. On one wall, someone had taped up drawings, childish sketches of animals and houses and families. On another, there was a map of the city with pins marking different locations. Near the sleeping bag, there was a cardboard box. Julian opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all addressed to him. Julian Vane, with the address of his company headquarters carefully written in his father's handwriting. None of them had been sent. He picked up the one on top, postmarked with a date from 2 years ago. Dear Julian, I don't expect you to read this. I don't even expect to send it. But I need to write it anyway, need to put into words what I've never had the courage to say to your face. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every night you went to bed hungry because I chose alcohol over groceries. I'm sorry for every eviction notice you had to read while I was passed out on the couch. I'm sorry for making you grow up too fast, for forcing you to be the parent when I couldn't even manage to be the adult. You deserved better. You deserved a father who showed up, who stayed sober, who fought for you the way you had to fight for yourself. I know I can't fix what I broke. I know apologies don't pay back rent or fill an empty stomach. But I want you to know that I see what you've become, and I'm proud. I'm proud that you survived. I'm proud that you built something real out of nothing. I'm proud that you didn't let my failures define you. I'm writing this from the Oakhaven Library, where I've been volunteering to tutor kids who remind me of you. Smart, determined, dealt a bad hand, but playing it anyway. I can't change the past, but maybe I can help make sure some other kid's future turns out better than mine did. That's not redemption. I don't deserve redemption, but it's something. It has to be something. With love and regret, Silas. Julian sat down on the concrete floor, the letter in his hands, and for the first time in 15 years, he cried. Not the silent, controlled grief he'd allowed himself when his mother died, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from the place he'd locked away when he decided that survival meant not feeling. Elias stood nearby, not speaking, not touching, just present. When Julian finally stopped, his throat was raw and his eyes burned. He folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box. How many students were there? He asked. 12 at the end. Your father taught every subject he could. Math, English, history, science. Some kids came every session. Some just came when they needed help. He never turned anyone away. He said education was the only inheritance worth leaving. Julian stood and walked to the blackboard. The equations were complex, high school level calculus. His father had barely graduated high school himself, but somewhere in the years since Julian had last seen him, Silas had taught himself enough to pass knowledge on to children who had no other access to it. What happened to the other students after he died? We scattered. Some went back to just doing public school. Some stopped coming because it felt wrong without him here. I kept coming because I have the key and because I needed to think. That's when I saw the demolition notice. That's when I started researching who owned the building and found out it was you. And you decided to blackmail me. I decided to make you look. I figured if you saw what your father built here, you might reconsider destroying it. Elias crossed his arms. I was probably wrong. Rich people don't usually change their minds once they've decided poor people's spaces aren't worth saving. The words stung because they were true. Julian had built his entire business model on that assumption. Sentimental value didn't appear on balance sheets. Community space didn't generate revenue. The Oakhaven Library was worth more dead than alive, at least according to the metrics Julian had spent 2 decades perfecting. But standing in the basement, where his father had slept on a concrete floor to stay close to students who needed him, Julian felt the machinery of his certainty grinding to a halt. The demolition is scheduled for Tuesday morning, he said. That's 48 hours from now, I know. If I stop it, I breach the contract with the construction company. I lose the deposit, probably $500,000. I lose the investors who've already committed to the residential tower. I lose credibility in a market where credibility is everything. Then don't stop it. Elias's voice was flat. Take your father's letters, take the date stamp, go back to your glass tower, and let the wrecking ball do what it's designed to do. In 5 years, there'll be luxury apartments here where people pay $3,000 a month for the privilege of living somewhere that used to matter to people who couldn't afford $3,000 for anything. You'll make your money. You'll build your legacy. And 12 kids will lose the one place that told them they were worth teaching. Julian turned off the flashlight. In the darkness, he could hear water dripping somewhere, a slow rhythmic sound, like a clock counting down. I need to think, he said. They left the library and drove back through the rain to Manhattan. Julian dropped Elias off at a corner near the bridge, watched the boy disappear into the shadows, then continued alone to his tower. He rode the elevator up 73 floors and stood again at the window, watching the city wake up as dawn broke gray and cold over the skyline. His phone buzzed with messages. His project manager wanted confirmation on the demolition timeline. His lead investor wanted an update on the Oakhaven development. His assistant wanted to know if he'd be in the office for the 9 o'clock meeting. Julian ignored them all. He opened his laptop and pulled up the file on Oakhaven. The numbers were clear. Acquisition cost, $2 million. Demolition and site prep, $3 million. Construction, $15 million. Projected sale value of the completed residential units, $38 million. Net profit after fees and taxes, $12 million. It was a good deal, a smart deal, the kind of deal Julian had built his reputation executing flawlessly. He closed the laptop. At 8 in the morning, he called his lawyer. I need to cancel the Oakhaven demolition, Julian said. You'll lose the deposit. You'll breach the development agreement. I know what I'll lose. Cancel it. Julian, are you sure? The investors will pull out. You've got $6 million in committed capital that will vanish the second they hear you're backing away from the project. Let it vanish. He hung up and called his project manager next. Stop the demolition. Effective immediately. We can't just stop it. There are contracts. There are I don't care. Find a way. If you can't, I'll find someone who can. By noon, the news had spread through his company like a virus. Julian Vane, the man who never backed down from a profitable project, had killed the Oakhaven development without explanation. By 2 in the afternoon, 3 of his major investors had requested emergency meetings. By 4, his board of directors had called a special session to discuss his fitness to lead the company. Julian sat through the meetings in a state of detached calm. He listened to the accusations, the concerns about his judgment, the questions about his mental stability. When they asked him to explain his decision, he simply said that the property had sentimental value he hadn't properly considered. When they asked him to reconsider, he declined. When they asked him to step down as CEO, he agreed. The formal removal took 2 weeks. His shares were bought out at market value, his severance negotiated, his name quietly scrubbed from the projects he'd spent years developing. By the end of the month, Julian Vane was no longer a billionaire. He was a man with a modest bank account, no company, and no plan. He didn't go back to the library immediately. Instead, he spent 3 weeks reading his father's letters. All 417 of them, every apology and expression of pride that Silas had written but never sent. He learned about the years after their separation, about his father's slow climb toward sobriety, about the relapses and the recoveries, about the decision to volunteer at Oakhaven because giving something back felt like the only way to move forward. When he finally returned to the South Bronx, it was early December and the first snow of the season was falling in soft, silent drifts. He knocked on the side door of the library and waited. Elias opened it, surprise flickering across his face before settling into cautious neutrality. "You stopped the demolition," the boy said. "I did. People are saying you lost everything." "Not everything. Just the things I built by forgetting where I came from." Elias stepped aside to let him in. The library was cold, the heat long since shut off. Julian followed the boy down to the basement, where a small space heater glowed orange in the corner, and 3 other children sat at the makeshift desks doing homework. "These are the ones who still come," Elias said. "Maya, Marcus, and Sophie. They need help with geometry." Julian set down the bag he'd brought. Inside were new textbooks, notebooks, pencils, a graphing calculator still in its box. He'd spent the last of his discretionary budget on supplies, on things his father would have wanted the students to have. "I'm not a teacher," Julian said. "Your father wasn't either when he started." He figured it out. For the next 2 hours, Julian sat with the students and worked through problems. He was rusty, his own math skills buried under years of spreadsheets and financial projections, but the fundamentals came back: triangles, angles, proofs. The children were patient with him, more patient than he deserved. When they left, bundling up against the snow, Elias lingered. "Why are you really here?" the boy asked. "I don't know," Julian admitted. "Maybe because this is the last place my father was proud of himself. Maybe because I need to understand what he saw here that was worth more than anything I was building. You could have just donated money, hired real teachers. You didn't have to lose your company." "I didn't lose it. I traded it." Julian looked around the basement, at the sleeping bag that had been his father's bed, at the blackboard covered in chalk dust. "I spent 15 years building things I thought mattered. Glass towers, profit margins, a name people recognized. But none of it felt like this." "Like what?" "Like it might actually mean something." Elias picked up the library date stamp from the desk where Julian had left it. He turned it over in his hands, the same gesture he'd made that first night in the tower. "Your father used to say that people remember buildings, but they live in moments. He said the library wasn't important because of the bricks. It was important because of what happened inside it." He was right. "So what are you going to do?" Julian didn't have an answer. Not yet, but as he walked through the library, past the shelves of forgotten books, past the rooms where his father had taught and slept and written letters he never sent, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not certainty, not control, but possibility. The possibility that redemption wasn't about erasing the past or building over it, but about learning to inhabit it differently. Over the next 3 months, Julian became a regular presence at the library. He came 3 nights a week, helping students with homework, slowly rebuilding the trust his demolition order had shattered. Word spread through the neighborhood that Silas's son was volunteering, and more children started showing up. By February, there were 20 students coming regularly. Julian spent his days applying for grants, negotiating with the city to restore basic services to the building, learning the bureaucratic maze that determined which spaces got resources and which got abandoned. It was harder than running a company, harder than closing million-dollar deals. Nobody cared about his past success. Every conversation started from zero. Every request required justification. Every small victory came after weeks of rejection. But slowly, incrementally, things changed. In March, the city agreed to restore water and heat to the building. In April, a local nonprofit donated money for roof repairs. In May, Julian convinced a private foundation to fund a part-time librarian position. The progress was microscopic compared to the speed at which he'd built his business empire, but it was real. Elias watched these developments with the same cautious neutrality he'd shown from the beginning. He came to the tutoring sessions, did his homework, helped the younger students, but kept his distance from Julian emotionally. There was no moment of breakthrough, no tearful reconciliation, just the slow accumulation of trust built through showing up, week after week, doing the work without fanfare. One evening in June, after the students had left, Elias found Julian in the main reading room. The space had been cleaned out, the damaged books removed, the floors swept. Sunlight came through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that floated like tiny stars. "The city inspector came by today," Elias said. "She said the building is structurally sound now. Said it could be reopened as a real library if someone wanted to run it." Julian looked up from the grant application he'd been writing. "Is that something you'd want? I'm 13. I can't run a library." "No, but you could help. You know this building better than anyone. You know what the neighborhood needs." Elias sat down in one of the reading chairs, the kind with wooden arms and worn leather cushions. "Your father used to sit here. Said it was the best spot in the whole library because you could see both the entrance and the windows. Said a librarian should always know who's coming in and what the weather's doing." Sounds like him, always thinking 3 steps ahead. He wasn't always like that. He told me once that he spent years not thinking at all, just reacting. Said it nearly destroyed him and definitely destroyed his relationship with his son. But he said he learned that thinking ahead doesn't mean knowing what's coming. It means being ready to adapt when the unexpected shows up. Julian closed his laptop. "He told you about me." "Not directly. But the first read his journals after he died. All of them. He kept them in a box in the back room. He wrote about you a lot. About how he wished he could talk to you. About how he was afraid if he reached out, he'd just drag you back down into the mess he'd made. I thought he didn't care enough to reach out. He cared too much. That was the problem." Elias looked at Julian directly, for the first time in months. "My grandmother says people make mistakes in opposite directions. Some people don't care enough and abandon their kids. Some people care too much and think their kids are better off without them. She says both kinds of mistakes come from the same place, fear." Your grandmother sounds wise. She is. She also says you're trying to fix something that can't be fixed by teaching math to strangers. Julian smiled, despite himself. "What do you think?" "I think you're not teaching math to strangers. You're teaching it to us, and maybe that's the only kind of fixing that matters." They sat in silence for a while, watching the light change as evening approached. Outside, the neighborhood was alive with sound. Children playing, music drifting from open windows, the rumble of the elevated train passing overhead. It was nothing like the pristine silence of Julian's former office, nothing like the controlled environment he'd spent years perfecting. It was messy and loud and real. "The grant I'm applying for would fund a full library reopening," Julian said. "Paid staff, regular hours, programming, for kids and adults. If we get it, this place could be what it was supposed to be. And if you don't get it, we keep trying. We find other funding. We make it work." Elias stood and walked to the window. "You know people in the neighborhood talk about you, right? They say you're the rich guy who lost everything trying to save a building. Some of them think you're crazy. Some think you're trying to ease your guilt. Some think it's a publicity stunt and you'll leave as soon as the cameras stop caring. What do you think?" "I think you're here because you don't know how to be anywhere else right now. I think you lost the life you built and you're trying to figure out if you can build something different. I think you're doing it in the place your father died because you're hoping it'll help you understand him. And I think it's working, at least a little bit. Julian joined him at the window. Below, the street was mostly empty now, just a few people walking home from work, a dog pulling its owner toward the park. You're a perceptive kid, Julian said. I have to be. When you're poor, you learn to read people. It's a survival skill. I'm sorry. For what? For almost destroying this place. For not knowing my father was here. For being the kind of person who valued profit over people. Elias shrugged. You stopped the demolition. That counts for something. But it cost me everything. Did it? Elias turned to face him. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you traded things you owned for things you're building. That's not the same as losing everything. The grant application was rejected in July. Julian started over with a different foundation. That application was rejected in August. In September, he finally secured partial funding from a coalition of nonprofits interested in neighborhood revitalization. It wasn't enough to fully reopen the library, but it was enough to start. By October, 1 year after his father's death, the Oakhaven Library had running water, functioning electricity, a new roof, and a small staff of 2 part-time employees. Julian worked as the volunteer director, managing operations, coordinating programming, writing endless grant applications. He lived in a small apartment 3 blocks away, a 1-bedroom walk-up that cost $900 a month, a far cry from the penthouse he'd once called home. His former colleagues stopped calling. His old friends, the ones who'd valued him for his wealth and connections, disappeared. He existed in a different world now, one where success was measured in children reading, in community members attending workshops, in a building that had been condemned, now serving its original purpose again. On the anniversary of Silas's death, Julian organized a small memorial. He invited the students who'd known his father, the neighbors who remembered him, anyone who wanted to come. 23 people showed up. They gathered in the main reading room, now bright and clean, and shared stories. Maya talked about how Silas had helped her understand fractions. Marcus remembered the way Silas always had snacks for kids who showed up hungry. Sophie cried when she described finding Silas's body in the basement and not knowing what to do. An elderly woman Julian didn't know talked about how Silas had helped her grandson learn to read. When it was Julian's turn to speak, he stood with the library date stamp in his hands, the bronze worn smooth by his father's touch. I didn't know my father at the end of his life, Julian said. I chose to stay away because I thought the distance would protect me from the pain he'd caused. But what I learned this year is that distance doesn't erase pain. It just leaves you alone with it. My father wasn't perfect. He made terrible mistakes. He hurt me in ways that shaped my entire life. But he also did this. Julian gestured to the library, to the people gathered, to the space that existed because Silas had decided that education mattered more than his own comfort. He took what was broken in himself and tried to turn it into something useful for others. That's not redemption. You can't redeem the past, but it's transformation. It's the choice to be different going forward. Even if you can't fix what came before. He set the date stamp on the circulation desk, the same desk where it had lived decades ago when his father worked here officially. This library is named Oakhaven, Julian continued. I looked up the history. It was built in 1924 with money donated by families in this neighborhood who wanted their children to have access to books. It was their way of investing in a future they wouldn't live to see. My father did the same thing in his way. He invested time and knowledge in children who reminded him of the son he'd lost. And now those children are helping to rebuild this place into something that will outlast all of us. After the memorial, people lingered. They ate the simple food Julian had provided, looked at the old photos of the library he'd found in the city archives, wrote messages in a memory book. Elias's grandmother introduced herself, a small woman with gray hair and intelligent eyes. "You're doing good work here," she said. "I'm trying. My grandson says you lost your company over this building." "I did. That was foolish." Julian smiled. "Probably, but it was also brave. Most people don't choose principle over profit. They talk about it, but when the moment comes, they choose the money." She paused. "Elias doesn't trust easily. His parents' death taught him that the people you love can disappear without warning. But he trusts this place now. He trusts that you'll keep showing up. Don't prove him wrong." "I won't." She nodded and moved away to talk to other neighbors. Julian watched her go, felt the weight of the promise he'd just made. Showing up was the easy part. Sustaining it, year after year, would be the real test. As the memorial wound down and people began to leave, Elias approached with something in his hands. It was a book, old and worn, with a library card pocket still glued inside the front cover. "I found this in the back room," Elias said. "It was your father's favorite. He read it every year, said it reminded him why he kept trying." Julian took the book. It was a collection of essays about education and democracy, published in 1952, the pages yellowed and fragile. Inside the front cover, in his father's handwriting, there was an inscription: "For Julian, when you're ready to understand why I couldn't stop trying to be better, even when I kept failing, the work matters more than the worker. The student matters more than the teacher. The future matters more than the past. I love you. I'm sorry. I hope someday you can forgive me. Dad." Julian's eyes burned. He closed the book carefully, holding it like the fragile thing it was. "Thank you," he said. Elias nodded. "He wanted you to have it. I just didn't know how to get it to you until now." They stood together in the library that had become the center of both their lives, the building that had been condemned and saved, the space that held grief and hope in equal measure. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, tearing down and building up, destroying and creating, moving forward because that was the only direction it knew. But inside the library, time moved differently. Here, the past and future weren't enemies, but collaborators, each informing the other, each necessary for the work of building something that might last. Julian had lost his empire of glass and steel. He'd lost his wealth, his status, his carefully constructed identity as a man who never looked back. But standing in his father's library, surrounded by students and neighbors, and the physical evidence that redemption sometimes looked like a slow, painful rebuilding rather than a grand, dramatic gesture, he understood that he'd traded one kind of legacy for another. His name wouldn't be on luxury towers. His face wouldn't appear in business magazines. He would never again move millions of dollars with a signature or command rooms full of executives. But he could teach math to a 13-year-old girl struggling with geometry. He could keep the heat running in a building that served people who couldn't afford heating in their own apartments. He could show up, week after week, doing the unglamorous work of making one neighborhood institution function in a city that had mostly forgotten it existed. It wasn't the life he'd planned. It wasn't the success he'd imagined. But it was real in a way his former life had never been. It cost him everything he'd built by running away, and it gave him back the possibility of becoming someone his father might have recognized. The snow started falling again as Julian walked home that night, the same soft, silent drifts that had been falling the first time he'd returned to the library. He thought about his father sleeping on a concrete floor, choosing proximity to students over comfort. He thought about Elias lying to get him through a door, risking arrest because he believed the library was worth saving. He thought about all the small, unglamorous choices that had brought him to this moment. Standing on a cracked sidewalk in the South Bronx, watching snow accumulate on a building that existed because enough people refused to let it die. His phone buzzed. A text from one of the part-time librarians. Heat's out again. Can you call the repair service in the morning? Julian typed back. I'll be there at 7 to let them in. It was a small thing, a maintenance issue, the kind of problem that would have been handled by subordinates in his old life. But now it was his problem, his responsibility, his work. And somehow, in the cold and the snow and the endless bureaucratic struggles of keeping one small library running, Julian Vane found what he'd been searching for without knowing it. Not redemption, not absolution, not even forgiveness, just the possibility that who you become matters more than who you were, and that sometimes the only way forward is to stop running from the past and start learning to live inside it differently. In the morning, he would call the repair service. He would fill out more grant applications. He would prepare for the afternoon tutoring session. He would do the work, day after day, week after week, building something his father had started and he'd almost destroyed. It wouldn't make headlines. It wouldn't restore his fortune. It wouldn't erase the years of distance between himself and Silas. But it would be enough. It had to be enough. The snow continued falling as Julian climbed the stairs to his apartment, and somewhere in the city, in the archives of a newspaper, there was a photograph of a gleaming glass tower with his name etched in steel above the entrance. But here, in this neighborhood, on this street, the only monument that mattered was a 3-story brick building with classical columns and a domed roof, filled with books and second chances and the slow, difficult work of transformation. Julian Vane had been an architect of glass and steel, a builder of empires, a man who erased the past to construct the future. Now he was something simpler and infinitely more complicated, a man trying to honor his father by finishing what Silas had started, one tutoring session, one grant application, one maintained heating system at a time. The work was unglamorous. The rewards were invisible to everyone except the students who showed up and the community that slowly began to trust that this strange, quiet man who'd given up everything to save their library might actually be worth believing in. And in the end, that was the only architecture that mattered, not the buildings that bore his name, but the lives that were changed because he'd learned, finally, to stop demolishing the parts of himself that connected him to where he'd come from. The library stood, the students came, the work continued, and Julian Vane, who had once measured his worth in millions, learned to measure it in moments. A child understanding a math problem, a neighbor finding a book they needed, a building that refused to die because enough people decided it was worth the fight. It was a smaller legacy than the one he'd planned, but it was his, and it was real.